The teeth of the dredging crane's clamshell bucket bit into the murky bed of Lake Pontchartrain, expecting only silt. Instead, they screeched against metal. What emerged from the black water was not debris, but an artifact from another time. A vintage steel beer keg, its surface a collage of corrosion. The crew nearly cast it aside, but two things gave them pause. Its weight was unnatural, far too heavy for an empty container, and a thick, crude weld sealed its circumference, a metal scar that promised this was no ordinary piece of junk. The call was made. Hours later, under the glare of portable floodlights, a plasma cutter sliced through the rusted steel. At that moment, the case of Jack Riley, the charismatic bartender who had walked into the humid Louisiana night in 1995 and dissolved into legend, was reopened. The ghost story had just been given a body. July 1995. 25 years before the dredging crane would pull his tomb from the lake, Jack Riley was alive. At 31, he was the king of his small kingdom, the polished mahogany bar at the Crimson Lantern in the French Quarter. He moved with a practiced ease, his hands never still, pouring drinks and collecting cash while holding 3 conversations at once. His smile seemed to know a secret you wanted in on, a magnetic quality that drew people in and made them feel like the center of the world. But beneath the charm was a quiet desperation. Jack's world had shrunk to the size of a poker table, and his luck had run dry. He owed money, a significant sum, to the operators of an underground casino called the Cypress Room, men who dealt in consequences, not credit. Friends would later recall the shadows under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hands when he thought no one was watching. The debt was a cancer, and it was metastasizing. Still, in those final weeks, he'd seemed different, hopeful. He spoke in vague terms to his sister about a way out, a lifeline he was about to grab. He called her his secret angel, a wealthy, connected woman who, he was convinced, would settle his accounts and help him start a new life, far from the neon glare of Bourbon Street. He believed he was on the verge of a great escape. That last night, he worked his shift like any other. The air was thick with humidity, the murmur of tourists, and the distant cry of a saxophone. At 2 a.m., he untied his apron, wiped down the bar for the last time, and collected his tips. A co-worker, wiping glasses nearby, asked him his plans. Jack just smiled that signature smile, a flash of confidence that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm off to meet someone," he said, "to finally settle the score." He pushed through the swinging doors of the Crimson Lantern and was swallowed by the humid night. He turned left, a familiar figure disappearing into the haze of street lamps and neon signs, his silhouette dissolving into the anonymous crowd. His apartment on Dumaine Street remained untouched. His last paycheck was never cashed. The city's official record would note that at approximately 2:15 a.m. on that July morning, after rounding the corner onto St. Peter Street, Jack Riley had ceased to exist. Back on the shore of Lake Pontchartrain, the operation shifted from recovery to analysis. The mobile crime lab's lights painted the scene in sterile white, turning the rusted keg into the centerpiece of an open-air autopsy. The interior was a solid, petrified mass, a grim geology of hardened quicklime, river sediment, and human bone, fused together by 25 years underwater. Forensic anthropologists worked for hours, painstakingly chipping away at the hardened mixture with the delicacy of archaeologists. The victim was male, adult, approximate height 6 feet. The skeleton was mostly intact. A healed fracture was noted on the left clavicle. Dental records, cross-referenced against the original 1995 missing persons file, provided the first concrete answer. The remains belonged to Jack Riley. Leading the resurrected case was Detective Jake Sullivan of the NOPD's Cold Case Unit, a man whose career was built on listening to ghosts. He had been a rookie patrolman in 1995, and the name struck a chord deep in his memory. The faded flyers had papered the French Quarter for months. "Have you seen Jack Riley?" Now, Sullivan had. He stood back, observing the methodical work, his mind already cataloguing the questions that screamed from the evidence. Who had access to industrial welding equipment and the skill to seal a steel keg so crudely yet so effectively? How does a container from Bayou Brew, a microbrewery that went defunct in 1998, become a coffin? Why use quicklime, a material not for hiding a body, but for actively destroying it, accelerating the very process of decay? These weren't the hallmarks of a simple murder. This was a disposal. And then, the most crucial discovery. As a technician carefully cleared sediment from the right hand, something glinted under the lights. Clutched in the skeletal fingers, fused there by time and pressure, was a single object. A tarnished disc of silver. After careful extraction and cleaning, the image on its face became clear. A stylized cypress tree. It was a custom-made poker chip from a long-vanished, notorious underground casino, the Cypress Room. For Detective Sullivan, the pieces formed an immediate, chilling mosaic. This was not a back-alley brawl that went too far. This was not a panicked crime of passion. This was an execution, meticulous, resourced, and brutally final. And someone had not only wanted Jack Riley dead, they had wanted him erased from the earth, transformed into a secret at the bottom of a lake, a secret that had just resurfaced. To understand the present, Detective Sullivan had to excavate the past. The original 1995 case file on Jack Riley was less an investigation than an obituary for one. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, its contents a testament to institutional indifference. It contained a handful of interviews, a cursory check of Riley's apartment, and a final, dismissive summary. The official theory was a narrative of convenience. Jack Riley, a man with a known gambling problem, had simply run. A ghost in a city of ghosts. The report noted his debts, but the follow-up was cursory. The name The Cypress Room appeared only once, in a transcribed interview with a fellow bartender, but it was never pursued. No one from its hierarchy was ever questioned. In the New Orleans of the mid-90s, certain doors remained closed for a reason, and investigators understood that knocking on them was a career-limiting decision. The case was quietly shelved within 6 months. What the file failed to document was the atmosphere on the street. In the bars and alleyways of the French Quarter, people knew. They didn't know the specifics, but they understood the grammar of violence. When a man in deep with a certain element vanished so cleanly, it wasn't a disappearance, it was a statement. Witnesses who might have seen something that night developed a sudden and collective amnesia. It was a symptom of a city where looking the other way was a survival skill. The prevailing rumor, a whisper that became an accepted truth, was that Jack Riley was now part of a bridge foundation. It was a local euphemism, a piece of grim folklore that served a dual purpose. It explained the impossible and served as a potent warning to others. It was a story that allowed everyone to move on, to forget the man and remember the lesson. This was the true crime, not just the murder, but the silence that followed. It was a conspiracy of inaction, a citywide consensus to let a dead man lie. The initial investigation didn't just fail to find Jack Riley, it actively participated in his erasure. The silence wasn't negligence, it was complicity. And it had given a killer 25 years of peace. With the poker chip from the Cypress Room as his compass, Detective Sullivan began navigating the treacherous currents of memory. His team fanned out across New Orleans, seeking anyone who had orbited Jack Riley's world in 1995. But 25 years is a long time. People move, people die, and those who remain learn to keep the past buried. The interviews were a study in fear and fog. A former waitress from the Crimson Lantern, now a grandmother living in Algiers, remembered Jack's smile, but her eyes went blank when Sullivan mentioned the Cypress Room. An old doorman, his memory clouded by decades of heavy drinking, spoke of a violent argument Jack had with a local businessman a few weeks before he vanished, but the details were a blur. The name Moretti was met with shaken heads and lowered voices. The wall of silence, erected in 1995, was still standing, fortified by time. While one team chased ghosts on the street, another was digging in a different kind of graveyard, the city's archives. With the Cypress Room being an illegal entity, it left no official paper trail. So Sullivan's team shifted focus, cross-referencing known associates of the casino with their legitimate business interests from the period. The name at the top of that list was Vincent "Vinny" Moretti, who, in 1995, was already the owner of a thriving seafood distribution company. For weeks, detectives sifted through a mountain of Moretti Seafood's financial records from that era. It was a tedious, soul-crushing task, a sea of invoices for ice, fuel receipts, shipping manifests, and payroll ledgers. They were looking for a needle in a haystack, a single transaction that was out of place. They catalogued every purchase, from truck tires to cleaning supplies, building a picture of a normal, profitable business. Then, they found it. Buried in a box of miscellaneous expenditures from August of 1995, a month after Jack Riley disappeared. It was a small, unassuming cash purchase order. The vendor was listed as Bayou Brew. The item description was for 12 damaged and decommissioned steel beer kegs. The stated purpose on the invoice was scrap metal. There were no records of any recycling or scrap metal sales in the company's financials for that entire fiscal year. The invoice for the kegs was a lead, but it was a cold one, pointing only to a corporate entity. The keg itself, however, had a clearer story to tell. Its origins led directly to Bayou Brew, and with that name, the investigation pivoted with the force of a tidal change. Digging into the brewery's history, detectives uncovered a name that had been mentioned in passing during the initial 1995 inquiry: Frank Dubois, the owner. Suddenly, a new, much simpler narrative presented itself. Frank Dubois was known for his volatile temper. Old police reports confirmed it, a prior charge for assault and battery from 1992. Witness statements from the old case file, previously dismissed as irrelevant, were re-examined. Multiple sources confirmed that just weeks before he vanished, Jack Riley had been involved in a loud, public, and violent altercation with Dubois at the Crimson Lantern over a substantial unpaid bar tab for Bayou Brew products. The theory was compelling and seductively straightforward. A hot-headed business owner, a significant debt, a public humiliation, and a brawl. It was a classic recipe for a crime of passion that spiraled out of control. Dubois had the motive. He had the means, an entire brewery full of kegs. When questioned, his alibi for that night in July 1995 was flimsy, a vague recollection of working late. For weeks, the full weight of the investigation fell upon Frank Dubois. Detectives built a mountain of circumstantial evidence. They re-interviewed everyone who knew both men, pressing for details about their feud. They treated Dubois as their prime and only suspect, a strategy that gave the real killer, who was undoubtedly monitoring the news of the discovery, a profound and dangerous sense of security. The investigation was convinced it had its man, but the theory, for all its neatness, had a fatal flaw. It couldn't account for the details. Dubois was a brawler, not a meticulous planner. The cold professionalism of the disposal, the industrial weld, the use of quicklime, the calculated sinking in a shipping channel, it didn't fit. And most importantly, it could not explain the silver poker chip clutched in Jack Riley's hand. The case against Dubois was a house of cards, and with no physical evidence to hold it together, it collapsed under its own weight. The trail had gone cold once more. The collapse of the Frank Dubois theory left the investigation adrift in a sea of dead ends. The keg, the lime, the poker chip, they were all facts without a story. Frustrated, Detective Sullivan went back to the beginning, back to the victim himself. He scheduled another interview with Jack Riley's sister, a woman whose grief had been resurrected only to be met with confusion. He wasn't looking for a new lead. He was looking for a detail he might have missed, any small texture of Jack's life in those final weeks. He asked her to ignore the gambling, to forget the debts, and to simply talk about Jack the man. She spoke tearfully of his charm, his recklessness, and then, her voice dropping, she mentioned it again. The secret angel. The wealthy, connected woman he was in love with. The woman he believed was his ticket out. It wasn't just a boast, she insisted. It was his salvation. He had even shown her a picture once, a keepsake he carried in his wallet. After a moment of hesitation, she retrieved a small box of her brother's effects the police had returned to her decades ago. Inside, tucked within a worn paperback, was a single, faded Polaroid. The image was a ghost from a summer afternoon. Jack Riley, younger, happier, is laughing on a balcony, his arm around a young woman. Her face is turned partially away from the camera, her features soft and indistinct in the hazy light. But the intimacy of the moment was undeniable. Back at the lab, the Polaroid was treated not as a memento, but as a piece of forensic evidence. Technicians scanned the image at high resolution, translating its faded chemistry into data. Digital enhancement software sharpened the edges, corrected the color, and began reconstructing the woman's partially obscured features. They then cross-referenced the enhanced facial geometry against a database compiled from 2 decades of New Orleans society pages, charity event photos, and newspaper archives. For hours, the algorithm churned through thousands of faces. Then, a match appeared on the screen. A 97% probability. The system pulled up a crisp, black-and-white photograph from a 1994 charity gala. The woman from the Polaroid, no longer a ghost, looked confidently at the camera. Her name was Maria Moretti, and the caption beneath the photo identified the man standing beside her, his arm possessively on her waist. Her husband, the seafood magnate Vincent "Vinny" Moretti. In that instant, every fact of the case snapped violently into focus. The poker chip wasn't just a clue to a debt, it was Vinny's calling card. The meticulously planned disposal wasn't the cold work of a mob enforcer settling a score, it was the rage of a powerful man betrayed. The motive was never money. It was jealousy, honor, and a secret affair that had signed Jack Riley's death warrant. Based on the evidence and the final damning testimonies, the last hours of Jack Riley's life can be reconstructed with chilling clarity. He did not walk into that July night expecting death. He was expecting salvation. He believed he was on his way to meet an associate of his secret angel, a rendezvous arranged to deliver the money that would wipe his slate clean. The chosen location was a quiet, disused pier in the Industrial Canal, a place where commerce slept and secrets could be kept. It was Vinny Moretti's territory. When Jack arrived, the silhouette waiting for him was not a friendly bagman. It was Vinny Moretti himself, and he was not alone. The hulking form of his enforcer, Silent Sal, stood beside him. In that moment, the trap snapped shut. Jack's hope curdled into confusion, then into cold, primal fear. The conversation would have been short. Vinny, a man whose pride was as vast as his fortune, would have made it clear he knew everything about the affair with his wife, Maria. This wasn't about money. This was about a transgression that, in his world, had only one penalty. Jack Riley, the man who could talk his way out of anything, finally found himself in a situation where words were useless. He was facing a judge, jury, and executioner whose verdict had been decided long before this meeting was ever arranged. The humid night air was then split by a single sharp crack. There was no struggle, no prolonged fight. Jack Riley's great escape ended right there on the splintered planks of the pier. The light in his eyes, which had burned so brightly at the crimson lantern, was extinguished in an instant. There was no grand exit, only a sudden, heavy stillness that was quickly swallowed by the chirping of insects and the distant hum of the city. The second act of the tragedy was one of cold, industrial efficiency. Under the cover of darkness, Vinny and Sal transported the body to a Moretti seafood warehouse. There, waiting among crates of ice and fish, was one of the decommissioned beer kegs purchased from Bayou Brew. The work was grim and methodical. Jack Riley was placed inside the steel container. Bags of quicklime were poured in after him, a chemical agent to accelerate decomposition and ensure that even if the keg was ever found, the evidence within would be compromised. Then came the final sealing act. The hiss and brilliant flare of a welding torch cut through the gloom of the warehouse as Sal fused the steel shut, creating a crude, permanent tomb. The keg was loaded onto one of Vinnie's boats and taken out onto the black, placid waters of Lake Pontchartrain. It was pushed overboard, entering the water with a muted splash before beginning its long, silent descent to the silt below. Vinnie Moretti had not just killed his rival, he had erased him, creating a chilling legend of a gambler who ran afoul of the mob, a story that would serve as a warning and solidify his own fearsome reputation for decades to come. Armed with a motive that redefined the entire case, Detective Sullivan tracked the digital ghost of Maria Moretti to a quiet suburban life in Austin, Texas. He found a woman who had spent 25 years looking over her shoulder. In a sterile interview room, confronted with the faded Polaroid of a life she had tried to bury, the dam of her silence finally broke. Her deposition was a torrent of guilt and fear, detailing the passionate affair and Vinnie's explosive discovery. She recounted the last conversation she ever had with her then-husband about Jack Riley, his voice cold with a terrifying calm. He had told her, "I'm going to put him on ice." The second piece of the puzzle lay in a state-run nursing home in the fractured mind of Silent Sal. Sullivan found him lost in the fog of dementia, a ghost in his own body. The detective laid two items on the table in front of him: the tarnished silver poker chip and a photograph of the young Maria Moretti. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, a flicker of recognition in the old man's vacant eyes. He lunged forward, grabbing Sullivan's arm with surprising strength. His voice was a dry, terrified whisper. "The angel." Jack flew too close. Vinnie. Vinnie made him a drink he couldn't refuse. A steel coffin for the bottom of the lake. The combination was irrefutable. Maria's testimony provided the motive. Sal's lucid confession provided the method. 2 weeks later, as Vincent Moretti accepted a philanthropic award at a black-tie charity gala, two plainclothes detectives stepped onto the stage. The click of handcuffs on his wrists echoed through the stunned silence of the ballroom. The city's hero, the pillar of the community, was exposed as a monster in a tuxedo. The trial was a formality. Vinnie Moretti, whose power had once guaranteed him impunity, was now just a man facing a mountain of evidence. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. For Jack Riley's sister, the verdict brought a sense of finality, but not peace. It was a period at the end of a sentence that had been written in grief decades earlier. Vinnie Moretti died of a heart attack 5 years into his sentence in the quiet anonymity of his prison cell. Justice, served 25 years too late, had finally closed the books, but it could not heal the wounds. It could only confirm the scars. Today, in a quiet wing of the New Orleans Police Museum, the silver poker chip from the Cypress Room rests on a bed of black velvet, sealed under glass. Its surface is still tarnished, but the image of the cypress tree remains sharp, a silent testament to a debt that was paid in blood. Beside it, a small brass plaque bears the name Jackson Jack Riley, finally acknowledging the man who was erased and then returned by the slow, grinding machinery of time and chance. The empire Vincent Moretti built on seafood and secrets crumbled with the verdict. His name, once etched on the walls of hospitals and charity foundations, is now a byword for a different kind of New Orleans legacy, one of violence hidden behind a polished veneer of respectability. Maria Moretti lives with a freedom purchased by her confession, forever haunted by the ghost of the man she loved and the monster she married. And in a state-run nursing home, the last fragments of the truth are dissolving in the fog of Silent Sal's mind, the final secret keeper silenced by his own biology. Out on Lake Pontchartrain, the coordinates where the dredging crane made its discovery are now just an anonymous point on a nautical chart. The water is murky, indifferent. For 25 years, it held its silence, serving as the perfect accomplice. It was a grave without a headstone, a vault without a key, guarding a story the city had long agreed to forget. New Orleans is a city built on secrets, a place that knows how to bury its dead and its stories with equal skill. Most of them stay buried, but Jack Riley's did not. His story serves as a cold reminder. In a city surrounded by water, the truth, no matter how deep you sink it, eventually has a way of rising to the surface.